The Secret of Madame de Pontarlier. In the small drawing room, where the ticking of the clock sounded just a shade louder than propriety allowed, Madame de Pontarlier sat, so still one might think she feared to startle her own thought. On the little table before her lay a letter, thin, almost weightless, like a promise no one ever intended to keep. For an hour, she had known there was nothing dangerous in it, and yet she held it between two fingers as though it might burn her. A woman accustomed to attention, to mirrors, to the soft rustle of bows and compliments, suddenly found herself face to face with something far more treacherous, silence, in which one could hear one's own heart. Her husband, good-natured and serenely confident, like a man who has never doubted that he is loved, entered the room almost noiselessly. He was smiling, the calm, slightly absent smile of someone who considers jealousy a sign of poor upbringing. "Is something troubling you, my dear?" She lifted her eyes, and for a fleeting instant something like fear flickered in them. But it vanished at once, like the shadow of a passing cloud. "Nothing," she said. "Women's fancies." He nodded, asking no further questions. He was certain that her world held no secrets that might concern him, and that certainty was his weakness and her strength. When he left, Madame de Pontarlier finally unfolded the letter. A few lines, polite, cold, almost official. No confessions, no threats, no memories that needed hiding. And yet she exhaled as though a weight had slipped from her shoulders. For the real secret was not in the letter. It lay in the fact that she had wanted there to be something dangerous in it. She had wanted to feel alive, not a wife, not the mistress of a salon, not the ornament of someone else's confidence, but a woman with a secret capable of altering the very breath of the world. But the letter was empty, and Madame de Pontarlier, smiling faintly to herself, folded it back with care, as one folds a dream that will never come true. Evening settled over the house, softly, almost tenderly, and only she knew that in this softness there was something cruel, a reminder that sometimes the most tormenting secret is the absence of one. A sentimental conversation. The evening was one of those seemingly designed for talks of the soul, soft, a little weary, with golden dust on the curtains and a faint scent of fading flowers. In the drawing room, where the armchairs stood a little too close together for it to be accidental, Madame L. and her longtime acquaintance, Monsieur R., were engaged in a conversation both had already decided would be elevated. She spoke quietly, deliberately, as though each word were a pearl to be laid upon velvet. He listened with the expression of a man long accustomed to thinking himself a subtle psychologist, now merely confirming his own legend. "Ah, how difficult it is to be a sensitive woman," she sighed, tilting her head slightly, as if listening to her own melancholy. Monsieur R. nodded with an air meant to convey deep understanding, though in truth it expressed nothing but self-satisfaction. He was certain her emotional turmoil was almost a confession in his favor. She went on about secret sufferings, tender tremors, inexpressible stirrings of the heart, and every phrase sounded as though it had been waiting for its cue to step onto the stage. There was something theatrical in her voice, but so graceful that it became part of her charm. He, inspired by her tone, launched into reflections on a lofty spiritual bond, a kinship of feelings, and the delicate vibrations of two attuned hearts. The words flowed easily, like wine that has long lost its flavor yet still warms pleasantly. And yet, beneath all this lace-like sentimentality, both felt a strange emptiness. as though they were playing a game whose rules they knew by heart, but in which they had long ceased to believe. When the conversation drew to a close, Madame L. smiled faintly, a smile with more weariness than tenderness. "How pleasant it is to speak from the heart now and then," she said. "Indeed," he replied, feeling he had said something important, though he could not recall a single phrase. They parted with the air of people who had just experienced something exalted. But as soon as the door closed, Madame L. removed the expression of refined sensitivity from her face like a mask and exhaled with relief. And Monsieur R., walking down the street, suddenly realized he could not remember a single one of her profound emotions, only the sound of her voice, like the rustle of expensive paper. And in that lay the cruelty of the moment. The sentimentality they had exchanged so earnestly proved as empty as a jewelry box long devoid of its treasure. The triumph of science. In the laboratory, where the air smelled of glass and self-satisfaction, Professor D stood over his latest invention. The machine, angular, gleaming with copper tubes that hissed as though arguing among themselves, seemed to him the pinnacle of human intellect. He looked at it the way one looks at a child destined to prove to the world that his father had been right all along. In the corner sat his assistant, a young man with nervous fingers and eyes reflecting a mixture of admiration and unease. He had long understood that the professor loved not science, but his own reflection in its mirror. Today, the professor declared, "We shall finally conquer human weakness." He spoke with the solemnity of a priest preparing to abolish sin. The machine hummed, flared, buzzed, and at that moment the man invited for the demonstration entered the laboratory. Modest, polite, with the expression of someone accustomed to not asking unnecessary questions. "You need only stand here," said the professor, pointing to the metal platform. The man obediently stepped forward. The machine shuddered like a beast given a command. The professor smiled. The assistant swallowed nervously. A moment later, everything fell silent. On the platform, nothing. No man, no shadow, not even a trace of scent. The professor raised his arms in triumph. "Do you see? Science has freed the world from suffering." The assistant stared at the empty space and thought that suffering might have been the last thing that made a human being human. But he said nothing. In this room, doubt was considered bad manners. The professor was already writing results into a thick notebook, certain that history would remember him as a savior. And the laboratory filled with a strange silence, the kind that appears when something living disappears. The machine crackled softly, as if digesting its first victim. And in that crackling, there was more truth than in all the professor's speeches. Because sometimes the triumph of science is nothing more than a triumph over those who never had time to ask why. Love of art. Artist L lived as though the world existed for one purpose only, to become his painting someday. He walked through the streets with the expression of a man who does not look but evaluates. Light, shadow, the texture of human faces, as if everything around him were merely a preparatory study for the great canvas he had yet to create. In his studio reigned a kind of order reminiscent of a temple. Brushes lay like ritual objects, paints were arranged by shade, and on the easel stood a canvas he touched with the caution of a lover afraid to startle inspiration. One day a young woman came to see him. Not a model, not a patron, simply an acquaintance who wished to observe a genius at work. She entered lightly, almost airily, and paused, looking at the artist the way one looks at someone too serious to be happy. "You love art so much," she said, "that you seem to forget about life." He smiled, thinly, wearily, the way people smile when they're certain they are misunderstood. "Life," he repeated, "life is merely material. Art is the goal." She stepped closer, studying his latest work. A portrait rendered with such cold precision that one felt the model might draw breath at any moment, yet never grow warm. "But art must be alive," she said softly. The artist looked at her, as though noticing for the first time that she had eyes, not merely an interesting shape of face. "Alive." He gave a faint, ironic smile. "The living is too inconstant. Art is the triumph over change." She wanted to reply, but fell silent. There was something cruel in his voice, not intentional, but inherent. A person who loves art too deeply inevitably begins to treat people as imperfect sketches. When she left, silence settled over the studio once more. The artist gazed at the canvas for a long time, then made a single brushstroke, almost invisible, yet decisive for him. And in that moment it became clear. He was incapable of loving in any other way. His feelings would always turn into lines, shadows, shades. He would seek perfection where a living heart beats unevenly, and each time he would choose the canvas, because the canvas does not answer. And in that lies his true love. And his tragedy. Faith. She always said she believed. Believed in people, in good intentions, in honesty, in fate, in the idea that everything would work out. If one simply looked at the world with a gentle smile and didn't ask too many questions. Her faith was light, almost airy, like lace on a cuff, and just as unreliable. One morning, she received a letter. A thin envelope, neat handwriting, the scent of someone else's road. She held it as though inside lay the answer to all her quiet hopes. The letter turned out to be short, too short to matter, and too polite to be sincere. A few phrases that could be read in any number of ways, and she, of course, chose the brightest interpretation. "He's writing to me," she said, and in her voice sounded that trembling trust that makes a person defenseless. Her friend, more experienced and less inclined to illusions, saw the letter differently. She saw the cold distance, the caution, the absence of real feeling. But aloud she said only, "Are you sure?" "Of course," she replied. "I believe." And in that moment it became clear. Faith is not what facts confirm. It is what a person chooses in order not to hear their own loneliness. Days passed. There was no reply, but she kept waiting with the same gentle smile, the same bright gaze so easily mistaken for happiness. When a new letter finally arrived, it was even shorter, almost empty, almost polite, almost honest. She read it and smiled, not because it contained anything good, but because her faith was stronger than the meaning of the words. Her friend wanted to speak the truth, but stopped herself. Some illusions are too fragile to touch. In the evening, she sat by the window, the letter resting on her knees. The lamplight made her face soft, almost childlike. And in that softness, there was something cruel, a reminder that faith sometimes serves not the world, but the person who fears seeing the world as it is. She sighed, quietly, almost happily, and went on believing. Death. He had always feared death, not the kind that comes suddenly, but the kind that sits somewhere nearby, patient, almost polite, waiting for a person to grow tired of living. One evening, when the house had already sunk into silence, he felt someone enter. Not footsteps, an impression, as though the air had grown denser and the shadows more attentive. He looked up and saw her. Not a skeleton, not darkness, not horror. Simply a woman in black, with a face impossible to remember, because it resembled everything a person has ever feared and hoped to see. "Have you come for me?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. She tilted her head slightly, as if surprised by the question. "I come to everyone," she said, "but not always for the reason they imagine." He tried to smile, but the smile came out crooked. I'm not ready." "No one is ready," she replied gently. "But it doesn't matter." He looked at his hands, so alive, warm, trembling, and suddenly he understood that he wasn't afraid of disappearing. He was afraid that his life might prove too light to be mourned. "Does it hurt?" he asked. She smiled faintly, barely noticeable, almost human, only for those who cling. He closed his eyes, and in that moment he realized he was clinging not to life, but to habit, to fear, to what had long ceased to be joy. When he opened his eyes again, she was gone. The room was empty, quiet, almost cozy. He inhaled, slowly, deeply, and for the first time in many years felt a strange relief. Death had not taken him. She had merely reminded him that one day she would, and that until that moment, everything else depended on him, and in that lay her cruelty and her mercy. The portrait. He had always believed that a good portrait was not an image of a face, but a verdict. An artist must see in a person what that person hides, even from the mirror. And that was why Madame de S.'s commission intrigued him. There was something too flawless in her smile to be true. She entered the studio in a dress the color of morning mist, carrying the calm of someone accustomed to being admired. She sat in the chair, folded her hands, and grew still, like a statue confident in its own beauty. "I want you to paint me as I am," she said. He allowed himself the faintest smile. "People always say that, never realizing that as I am is not what they are prepared to see on a canvas." He began to work. First the lines, then the shadows, then that barely perceptible curve of the lips that revealed more than any words. She watched him with a touch of coquetry, certain the artist was captivated by her appearance. But the artist saw something else. He saw the weariness hidden beneath her perfect posture, the doubt beneath her smile, and the thin, almost invisible cruelty in the way she looked at the world, expecting it to be indebted to her. When the portrait was finished, he stepped back. On the canvas was she, but not the woman she was used to presenting, the one she concealed. Madame de S. approached. Her face changed, barely, but enough to show she recognized herself. The real self. "This," she began, but no words followed. "This is you," the artist said quietly. She looked at the portrait for a long time, and for the first time, she stopped smiling. "I cannot accept this," she said at last. "It is too revealing." He nodded. He had known it would be so. People want the truth only until they see it. She left, abandoning the portrait. The artist remained alone, with the canvas that held the image of a woman who could not bear her own reflection. He looked at the painting once more, and thought that art is sometimes more honest than a person can endure. The funeral. The weather that day was strikingly clear, almost festive, which in itself felt like a mockery. The city went on with its usual life, and only the small procession moving slowly down the street reminded anyone that something final had happened nearby. The coffin was modest but carefully decorated, the way one adorns things meant to look more expensive than they are. Behind it walked a handful of people, relatives, acquaintances, and a couple of those who had come more out of propriety than feeling. At the front was the widow. Her face was impeccably calm, almost ceremonial. She held a handkerchief, but did not use it. Grief, like everything else in her life, was under perfect control. "He was a good man," she said to someone beside her, and her voice carried such certainty that no one would have dared contradict her. Yet there was something strange in that certainty. Too even, too calculated. One of the men walking behind leaned toward another and whispered, "She speaks as if she's reading an inscription on a monument." "What else can she do?" the second replied. "The living always try to appear more dignified than the dead." When the procession stopped at the grave, the widow stepped forward. She looked at the coffin as though evaluating a craftsman's work, not saying farewell to a person. There was no despair in her gaze, no pain, only a neat, almost aesthetic sorrow. The priest spoke a few words. The words were proper, familiar, smooth, like pebbles that had long since lost their sharp edges. When the coffin was lowered into the ground, the widow finally raised the handkerchief to her eyes. But even that gesture was too precise, too graceful to be spontaneous. "He would have wanted everything to be dignified," she said. And in that moment it became clear. Funerals are not about the dead. They are a performance by the living, trying to convince themselves that everything was right, beautiful, respectable. When everyone left, only silence remained in the cemetery. The kind of silence that contains neither dignity nor decorum, only truth. And the truth was simple. The dead do not care, and the living go on playing their roles. The happy man, he always said he was happy. He said it with such confidence, such volume, that people began to doubt. Not his happiness, but their own hearing. Happiness, as a rule, is quiet, but his was demonstrative. Every morning he stepped outside with the air of a man who had just received a personal letter of gratitude from fate. He greeted everyone, smiled at each passerby, spoke of how wonderfully life was arranged and how important it was to appreciate simple things. People listened and felt a faint irritation, not because he was happy, but because he tried so hard to show it. One evening his friend, a man more observant than talkative, decided to drop by unannounced, just to see how the happiest man in the district lived. He knocked. No answer. The door was unlocked. Inside, silence. A silence so dense it seemed to hold the walls in place to keep them from collapsing. The room was tidy, but strangely empty. On the table, a cup of tea half finished. On the chair, a neatly folded coat. On the floor, a small note. The friend picked it up. There is only one sentence. "I'm tired of being happy." Nothing more. No explanations, no excuses, no requests. The friend stood for a long time, holding the note, and suddenly understood that the happiness the man had spoken of so loudly was not a feeling, but a duty, a role he played for others, and from which, one day, he simply could not catch his breath. When people learned what had happened, each said something like, "But he was so happy," and that was the cruelest irony. No one had seen the man. They had seen only the mask he held so diligently. And masks, as we know, cannot cry, and cannot ask for help. A letter from the dead. He received the letter early in the morning, at that hour when the world has not yet awakened and thoughts are especially vulnerable. The envelope was old-fashioned, thick, with ink slightly faded. The handwriting was strict, assured, as if the writer had doubted none of his words. He tore the envelope open, unfolded the sheet, and froze. The letter was from a man who had been buried 3 days earlier. At first he thought it was someone's cruel joke, but the lines were too precise, too personal, too unmistakable. Only one person could have written this, the one already lying in the ground. "My friend, when you read this letter, I will already be gone. but I want to tell you what I did not manage to say in life. He reread those words again and again, feeling a strange, cold stirring rise inside him. The dead man wrote of things no one else could know, conversations held in private, thoughts shared only with him, fears never spoken aloud. But most unsettling was this. The letter was written as though the author knew he would die on that exact day, at that exact hour, as though death had not been an accident, but a punctual visitor. He sat down, placed the letter on the table, and stared at it for a long time, not daring to touch it again. The room grew quiet, too quiet, the kind of quiet that exists only when something is present that should not be. He tried to explain it rationally. The letter could have been written in advance, sent in advance, planned in advance. But every line carried a strange freshness, as if the ink had not yet fully dried. And then, the final sentence. I hope you will forgive me for leaving first, but we will see each other again. Soon. He read it several times. The word soon seemed to shift on the page. At that moment, someone knocked softly on the door. Once. A pause. Again. He lifted his head, slowly, like a man who already knows what he will see, and suddenly understood. Some letters do not arrive to be read. They arrive to warn.